let us say good evening and welcome to Associate Professor Grant Duncan. Grant is from the School of People, Environment and Planning at Massey University. Good evening, Grant.
Good evening, Pat. Thank you for having me on your show.
Very excited to have you. Very excited to have you because we found your opinion piece, and let's bring it up, your writing, towards the end of last week. And we had spent the week talking about 2 or 3 different parts of Newshub's polling for that week, and specifically just last week, yeah? And we talked a little bit about the word cloud, and we talked a little bit about the interview with the Prime Minister on the AM show that was related back to their polling, and we talked about the polling itself. And so we found your article towards the end of the week, I guess because it came out towards the end of the week, talking about the misleading poll reporting by Newshub following the recent Labour Party conference. So I guess, Grant, before we do anything else and kind of delve into it, just the floor is yours. What do you want to share about what your article had to say and what you want to be a part of? What you want to let us know about?
Well, it's funny how it rolled out, actually, Pat, because sometimes when a poll comes out on the 6 p.m. news, I might get a call from someone to comment, and that happened. That's not unusual. And I did initially say, oh, look, this headline, whopping drop for Labour, is a bit overhyped.
Right.
And then I also got invited by Wallace Chapman to speak on the panel on Monday afternoon. And on that show, I went a little bit further and I said, look, what really bugs me here is the way in which media are trying sometimes to create the political narrative rather than report on it and interpret it for us. They're driving, there's a hubris there, which really annoys me because I would never do that as an academic. Right. I don't see why journalists should allow themselves to do that. Anyway, and then one of our communications people at Massey said, hey, would you mind just, writing up a little piece about the polls and the biased reporting? And on Monday morning, I didn't think much about it. Monday afternoon, I didn't think much about it. Tuesday, it must have been, and wrote those words and gave them to our comms people. Interestingly, Pat, they couldn't get any of the media outlets to run with it.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you that, Grant. It's like I googled it again today to find it, to have it for tonight, and I think the only place I found it was on the Massey website. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. So the media won't comment on the media.
No, they wouldn't. They did put it out there on offer for the media. No one picked it up, and I just quipped to our comms person, Deborah. Oh, hey, academic criticises 6 p.m. news is hardly exciting, is it? Anyway, so they just put it on the Massey News website, and I thought, oh, that's fine. And then, strangely enough, it got picked up by a few people on Twitter, and it just generated a lot. I mean, I don't think they pushed it on Twitter, Massey, but it just got picked up by some people, and it drew a lot of comment. And I was quite surprised because to me it seemed like a slightly nerdy sort of issue, but nonetheless, nonetheless, it sort of, I wouldn't say it went viral, but it got quite a bit of comment. And then next thing you know, 1 or 2 other, and yourself, you're approaching me and so forth. So it seems to have struck a little bit of a chord. I think, what you're doing on your program, critiquing Newshub, is really great because I think, we need to be keeping these people honest, particularly as we approach election year. We need to start now lining this out because, as an academic, I pride myself on trying, no one's perfect. I pride myself on trying to be impartial and balanced.
Yep.
And one of the best compliments I ever get from a person is when they say to me, hey, I liked your comments. It sounded really balanced.
Right.
And one of the best compliments I've ever had from a student is when they say to me, Grant, I still can't work out whether you're left or right, liberal or conservative, And to me, I think, that it's working. Because although, of course, I do have my own opinions, I do have my own vote, but I pride myself personally on being impartial, and I think it's most important for a person who's teaching political studies that we should, not all of my colleagues do this, but that we should, in my opinion, strive to be like that. And some of my colleagues are really good about it. And the same with journalists, because particularly journalists in the big national programs, where particularly when they're somehow state-owned or taxpayer subsidized or something like this. Similarly with universities, we're a public institution. We're open to everyone who's academically qualified.
Mm-hmm.
We need to be balanced and inclusive, politically inclusive, I mean, and not, one-sided.
Yeah, I also think, and I don't, you've kind of discovered, I guess, a bit more about what we do since I've contacted you, but from day one, we're like, this is where we sit politically, but we do play each ball on its merits. So we've spent time criticizing Labor and the left, even though that's where we sit, and we've spent time congratulating and upholding what the right has said, because that was appropriate for the issue that was at hand. And I think that what frustrates me is like when the news couches opinion as data or fact, and like you say, what was the word? A whopping or a terrible,
whopping
whatever the
drop.
Whopping drop. That word whopping is the relative term, that's the opinion term, because what's whopping to you may not be whopping to me. And I think I said in your article, not a very good poll for Labor, let's be honest, but it had an angle to it. And through the rest of the week, and I've brought up one of the things we talked about last week, because we talked about the cloud that they also did as a part of Reid Research, same conversation. And this was the headline that they put out about the cloud: deceitful dictator, arrogant smarmy, right? So deceitful dictator were the words they picked out of the cloud relating to the Prime Minister. Now, if you actually look at the word cloud, the main words are caring and good. And way over here that you can hardly see is the word deceitful, and the one below it is dictator. Or I can't even read them, they're so small. So the other thing is, if people have opinion in the news and they share it as opinion, great. We know it's opinion. But I'm concerned, A, when people share opinion as data or the news, but B, how they then sometimes couch the news, because it's true that the word dictator was there, but when I see it in a headline, I would expect it to be the most accurate representation or the biggest. And as we can see with this word cloud, the most accurate representation for what people thought of the Prime Minister was caring and good, followed by kind. And that's not what Newshub said. And that's when I said earlier about, to me, it felt like there was an angle, whether it's an ideological angle coming in, or whether they're just going, oh, this will work, because this is the vibe of the nation. So if we talk the PM down, that'll get more clicks equals more revenue. I don't know what it is for Newshub, but it certainly seems at the moment that they have a perspective around let's shit on Labor and the PM, basically.
Oh yeah, the context here to remember is that this poll was released 6 p.m. Sunday of the weekend of the Labor Party annual conference.
Right.
So this was knowingly, deliberately dropped to demoralize Labor supporters and activists. And also, you see, the thing is, it was devoid of context, because the whopping drop was between an April poll, that the last Reid Research poll, and the November poll. The April poll was, for April, relatively high for Labor.
Right.
And the November poll was pretty much in keeping with the polls over the last 6 months between May and November. So this is what I think happens, is that, you see, if you think about, follow the money here, so to speak, Pat. The Reid Research is a commercial marketing research organisation.
Yep.
It's basically giving data to TVNZ. The payoff for Reid Research is they get massive publicity on the 6 p.m. news. So they're doing quite well out of it. But it's an editorial decision, clearly, for Newshub to have used the word, this is a whopping drop between April and November, completely devoid of the context of the numerous polls that had happened between May and November. So if they had taken but then they would have had to mention polls that weren't Reid Research's polls.
Yeah.
You see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, advertising someone else's product.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. So therefore, there was no I think there's a conflict of interest going on here because of their relationship with Reid Research, frankly.
Right.
And I would question them about that. But the reporting was devoid of context in relation to intervening polls. The reasonable response would have been to say, oh, look, another not very impressive or arguably even disappointing poll for Labor because it was in keeping with polling. So in other words, Labor had been polling consistently between about 30 and 35 for about 5 or 6 months. So this was not a whopping drop.
It was in keeping with the poll of polls, basically, the rest of them at, ish.
Yeah. Yeah, so it wasn't good news for Labor by any means. It's not where they would like to be, of course. And, and when I was speaking to Wallace Chapman on the panel, I was quite happy to say that, to be a bit critical of Labor and say, look, I can't really see at the moment quite how they're going to dig themselves out of this hole.
Agreed.
And so I'm not, going into bat for Labor or anything like that. But all I'm looking for here is an honest reading of opinion polls, a critical reading of opinion polls, because opinion polls are not fact. I mean, well, it is a fact that they are reported, but by the polling company.
Yep.
There's a whole lot of questions here about their validity and accuracy, and I think I mentioned in that column on Massey News there about how going into the 2020 election, they were actually quite significantly inaccurate.
Yeah, you talked about being at +5 and -5. I haven't got. Here we go. Furthermore, they were under. This was the polls. The polls came out during the fortnight advance of voting 2020, for example, were overestimating National by an average of 5.8% compared with National's actual election result of the party vote, and that was consistently outside the margin of error. Let me just bring it up for other people to see. Furthermore, they were underestimating Labor by 3.7, while the Green and Māori parties were also underestimated by 1.1 and 0.7. Well, look, on that, I'd like to ask you as well, because we've just seen another example of polling coming out of the US, the much talked about red wave. The much talked about polls that were coming out, I think, places like 538. I mean, I don't know how 538 holds its head up anymore. I'm not saying they're doing anything nefarious, but, ever since they were so far out when it came to Trump, I don't, and again, it doesn't just, I wonder if it's the methodology. I wonder if people lie, and it's just, they don't seem to have, be worth the paper they're literally written on.
Well, let me help you out here a bit, Pat.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I believe that it's in the interests of polling companies to be as accurate as they can.
Mm-hmm.
They have a professional reputation as commercial organizations often, not all of them, particularly in the US, some of them aren't commercial, but they have an interest in being as accurate as they can. They want to be. It's just proving harder and harder to be. And 538 all they're doing is they're bringing together all of these polls, their poll of polls. They're not pollsters themselves, they're modelers. So, they're reliant on these polls too, which are getting increasingly accurate. And I've listened to some of their nerdy talk, actually. They're really great guys. I've listened to some of their nerdy polling modeling talk where they really did angst about what was happening with the polls, particularly after the 2020 presidential race, which, although, it rightly predicted that Biden would win, but it was by a much lower or narrower margin. Now, the interesting thing here, Pat, is this, that similarly in Australia in 2019, people underestimated the right in the polling, embarrassingly in Australia in 2019.
Yeah.
But also, the Trump 2016 and to some extent the Biden 2020 win was much narrower than expected. In New Zealand, it's the opposite, where the pollsters were underestimating the left, not the right. And I can't figure this out. So on election night, I was expecting, based on the polls, Labor would land maybe 46, 47. National would be 30, 31. And when I saw numbers for Labor coming up 49, 50, I'm thinking, oh, no, early in the evening, it'll shift. But no, Labor ended up on 50, and that was not what we were expecting based on the polls.
Yeah.
Now, I've also done, polls on stuff.co.nz, which are just open slather. not representative samples, just anyone pile in. And we always
as long as you've got an internet connection, you can go tick.
Yeah,
yeah,
that's right. And similarly, their Labour supporters were underrepresented. So, funnily enough, we have had in New Zealand the opposite effect of Australia and the US. But in the US, it's in the midterms, it switched around again. You see, they've overestimated the right this time. I mean, I'm going to, no doubt there will be a post-mortem on 538 about this very question, and I'm looking forward to hearing it. But really, listening to those guys over there, because they're much more skilled and they've got a much bigger polling industry than we have. It's massive compared to ours, much more sophisticated. And they're stumped as to what's causing these shifts and these inaccuracies in their polling. They're trying to change their methodology. But all I'm saying, to sum it up, though, Pat, is this. When you see an opinion poll, don't take it literally.
Yeah. Yeah. Is this the part where we get to how do we as people... before I ask you that question, I'm going to throw to Nick. Nick's got a question for us both. Pat and Grant, you might know who decides to have the angle behind the scenes. Is it a producer type person or the person who plans it? Is there oversight from media execs? And just before you maybe speak to that, if you have an opinion on it, I had this realization after I talked about the cloud one, and the realization was quite simply this heading of deceitful dictator, arrogant smarmy, what I actually did was I've actually written, I know the person who heads up news at Newshub, and say, could you tell me how many people of that poll actually wrote deceitful? Because I'd like to know, because is it 1? Is it 3? Is it 5 out of 1,000? And for it to be a heading, though, to speak to Nick's question, that's an editorial decision by one person to decide that. So I don't have an answer for you, Nick, about who decides that. But to put, now, we know in this day and age, people scroll through Twitter, they look on Facebook, they go through websites, they get notifications on their phone. Sometimes that's all the news they read. So they don't actually go into the story. Now, if they had gone into the story, they would have seen that caring and kind were the biggest words. But if they don't, they come away from that story thinking the Prime Minister is a deceitful dictator and the Leader of the Opposition is an arrogant and smarmy, which weren't his top words either, although they were significantly larger than deceitful and dictator. So that was an editorial decision made by one person. But when it comes to the actual polls, I'm not sure. I mean, TVNZ, it'll be, I mean, like I did think about maybe messaging Mike McRoberts, who was reading the teleprompter when this came out, going, do you have any idea what you're reading? It's like what you're reading is such horse shit. It's like you're putting, it's not wrong because those words are there, but you're putting it out there like it's the main point of this article, and it's not. Like, who writes that script? Who is the person who does it? Is it management? Is it a sub editor? Is it just the person on the teleprompter? I don't know, but I think, yeah, that's, I guess, next question. And so what I'm saying to you, Nick, is I don't know, but someone's making those decisions to angle that position. I guess equally someone's making the position, and maybe it's the journalist, on how the massive whopping drop.
There's some questions here for an investigative journalist, actually, to inquire into what's going on, because first of all, I would doubt that the phrase whopping drop comes from Reid Research. We could ask. But what I'm wondering here is also why, what kind of contractual relationship exists between Newshub and Reid Research such that they can't report the polls in between? Is there some kind of constraint in their contract that says they can't do that? In other words, preventing them from properly reporting on context and intervening polls. In other words, the trend in the polls. And as for who made that, who decided to use the word whopping, would be an editorial question that I would like answered, honestly. But as an academic, it's not really for me to do that kind of investigative inquiry. But they should be held accountable as to why they have been distorting their stories and their storytelling, their narrative, in the way that you pointed out about deceitful and tyrant, and the way that I've pointed out about whopping drop, who is making these decisions and on what grounds do they think they can do this? They purport to be national level broadcasting agencies. They are not performing a public service if they are distorting the facts this way and not properly reporting things in context. This is less than responsible, as I put it rather mildly in my comments. I could have used stronger language than that. But they need to be held to account because this is meant to be a service to the public. And when they report these polls on the 6 p.m. news, it's as if it were some kind of fact. And then they go on to reading tea leaves about how many, and literally this is reading tea leaves at this stage. What would this translate into in terms of seats in the House? Now we're reading tea leaves. Because as I say, I do believe that I don't think that the polling companies are out to deceive us. They want to be accurate. It's in their professional, reputational interest to be accurate. But the thing is, the classic one, Pat, was the Auckland Central electorate polls done before 2020, 2 of them, which had Chloe Swarbrick running 3rd. Who won that?
Right, wow. Yeah, Chloe.
By a healthy margin? Chloe did. But they were 2 polls before that had her running 3rd.
And the reason that can impact democracy is if you think for either side, either if you are going to win or aren't going to win, it can affect how people respond and vote. For Winston Peters, for a very long time, he thought there should be no polling in the month leading up to the election. That was when polling didn't help him. I see now that polling's sort of helping him. He wants as many as possible. Classic Winston. But if you think Chloe was going to come 3rd, 4th, 5th, whatever, you're like, it's not really worth getting out and voting there. It's not a big deal. So I guess, I'm looking at our email today when you talk about critically reading opinion polls. I guess what you said earlier is not believing them as fact. I mean, they're almost all sort of opinion and conjecture. Well, they are conjecture, aren't they?
Well,
the interpretation of them from the journalists is.
It's a sampling issue. And the problem that a pollster has is, first of all, getting a representative sample of voters, of New Zealand voters, but also they have to get them to tell the truth. And a lot of people just lie for the sheer sake of it. But so it is actually a difficult thing. And the problem that we're having now is particularly, and it was clearly highlighted by the Auckland Central poll, because clearly the people who the pollsters were having trouble getting through to there were the young, hip student or recent graduate population of, big population in Auckland Central of young, single or semi-single people who are, who really love Chloe. But these are the people who don't pick up the phone when they see an unknown number, or if they were invited onto an online panel, not interested, way too many more interesting things to do online than do some stupid opinion poll.
Yeah, no, look, I can also speak a little bit too from working within the mainstream media for a very long time. That thing about not referencing other people's polls, New Zealand media en masse have a real problem with talking about what the other media groups are doing, giving them credit. And I used to rally and used to love watching people like Dave Letterman, who would have someone from CBS on, a guest from ABC, a guest from HBO, and he'd literally be promoting their product because they understood that content is king. Good content is good content. And it's one of the things I like about doing this. We're not constrained by anything. And if I was to ever do this with a group, one of the stipulations would be I'm not going to not talk to your opposition or other parties, because I worked for News Talk ZB for the best part of a decade. And there's no way we could have had someone from, then MediaWorks is now, on to as a guest or on as a, you just couldn't do it. TV3 is never going to have someone on from TVNZ to talk about, the latest David Bain show starring, whoever it's starring. It's just not going to happen. And I think that shows how so many up higher in New Zealand media don't get it, because content is king. And if you get good content and eyes on your product talking about someone else's product, that's okay. And I think that might have some part to do as well with not highlighting other people's polls.
Yeah, I think so. And it's sad because, these things I mean, particularly when you're talking about public broadcasters, these events, you know, are supposed to be free-to-air public service reporting. And sometimes, and this also applies to the TV1 Kantar polls, they're not telling you, for instance, how many undecided voters there were in that poll, and they're not reporting the polls. You see, I've often said this to many reporters, is that where the polls are useful is if you treat them as trends. In other words,
Yeah,
you
totally.
look at the whole series of polls and you look at them as a trend. And so you could see very clearly, for example, that when Luxon became leader of the National Party, they started to trend upwards. Well, you know, it seemed a reasonable assumption that one thing had followed the other, so to speak. But you could see the trend happening, and it was a fairly solid one. And it seems now that we've reached a kind of plateau where it seems to be fairly finely balanced between the left coalition and the right coalition. Interesting times, you know. What happens between now and 2023, who knows? So don't go reading tea leaves about seats in Parliament. That's really silly, because if we put ourselves back at this time in the electoral cycle, before the 2017 election and before the 2020 election, no one could have predicted what was to come.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
I often remind people about the Don Brash Orewa speech, when National went up in the polls and then spent 14 months just doing this and lost to Labour at the end of the following year. So, yeah, it is a snapshot of what's happening today, taken with a more than just a grain of salt. And as they always say, not to be boring, but the only poll that really matters is election day, I guess, in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, and so, I mean, I've no problem with them reporting the polls. It's just the tone that they do it, and also the way that it's presented as the leading headline on the 6 p.m. news.
Yeah.
And really, honestly, it's just not that important. An opinion poll is not such a big event. There's actually much more important things going on in the world, honestly. And so to me, that poll was simply not news. 32.3%, whatever it was, for Labour. That's not news. That's more or less in keeping with what's been happening for the last 5 months in those polls. As for what happens in the election, it's anyone's guess. People like me often get asked to make predictions, and I have a standard line which goes, I don't make predictions.
Hey, Grant, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on tonight, Associate Professor Grant Duncan.
Fabulous to speak to you, Pat. Really
from Massey University. No, I very much appreciate your thoughts, and yeah, there's a ton of chat going on in the chat. I'll let you go because I won't put you through a bunch of those things, and then yeah, we'll move on, and I'm sure we'll have you back on again. And if you do like predictions, if you're someone who's into predictions, I'll just say coming up next, we're going to talk a little bit about the midterm elections when CNN talked to Alan Lichman. Of course, you'll know well the keys to the White House, the 13 questions from Alan Lichman. Seems to be one person that's pretty good at predicting quite a long way out. So we'll talk about that next, and I'll talk to you another time. But thank you so much for joining us.
Keep up your good work, Pat.
Appreciate it. All the best.
Okay.